Okay, so just first again, I want to thank Vivek for coming out today. I know the NBA playoffs have been going hectic lately, and last night especially was insane. I just before we jump to all Raptors discussion, I want to know your thoughts on the Bucks getting upset by Jimmy Butler, and what do you think they should do going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it was insane to see a championship team collapse like that in the fourth quarter. And then in overtime, like right away, it looked like, they were zombies. Like they were just completely out of it. It was almost like they were stunned that they were going into overtime in the first place. And that mediocre, absolutely garbage level of execution,
Mhm.
I think it's going to cost Budenholzer his job. I think it should cost him his job. I think the Bucks would be making a huge mistake if they kept him. And even when you hear Giannis say after the game that we made no adjustments and goes into all that stuff, I think that's a huge sign of where the players are at with him.
Mhm.
So I would expect a change. Ironically, I do think Nick Nurse would be an excellent fit for them
Yeah,
as someone who is known for his adjustments. Probably fits better with a veteran group, which the Bucks are, and so I think if I were the Bucks front office, I would be pursuing him very heavily.
Mhm. It was interesting too. I was watching the game and I noticed he wasn't calling a timeout when they had it. I believe it was two timeouts left. It was just interesting. I
He
don't
did it
know.
twice. He
It
did it twice. He
it
did it
was in
when there
regulation,
were.
right?
He did it in regulation when there was point 0.5 left after Jimmy tied the game. And
Hmm.
then on that final play, when you could see the Bucks were kind of scrambling, like why not take a timeout and draw something up? And instead, he just lets Grayson Allen dribble out the clock.
I found that because when I was watching the game, I was, why didn't he call the timeout? Also, I feel like the Bucks were just playing so poorly in clutch time situations. When Giannis fouled the 3-point shooter, he didn't really need to do
Hmm.
that. Missing free throws. Do you think, like, if you were in that situation, how do you think the Bucks could have adjusted? Like, should they have like double team Jimmy more? Is there, besides calling the timeout, besides the obvious, but is there anything they should have done in those situations to help secure the W?
I definitely think you needed to change up the tactics on Jimmy. You could see the way he was even barking at Drew Holiday, like he was loving that matchup, right? And I think to give Jimmy a different look, and I think this goes back to the first quarter where I think Jimmy really, really respects Giannis, and the way that first quarter played out, when Giannis was defending him early, Jimmy kind of deferred to his teammates, and that's when Gabe Vincent kind of got going.
Mhm.
But you saw that respect he has in terms of going at Giannis. And the
Mhm.
second Giannis checked out of the game in that first quarter, Jimmy was like, "Okay, it's time to get going."
It's something.
Yeah,
No,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
so that's where, like, if I'm a coach and I'm
Mm.
seeing that in the fourth quarter, especially when things are getting tight, I'm saying, okay, like obviously he has that respect for Giannis. Let's see how he does against him. Even the final play, I disagree with having Giannis like trying to, intimidate the inbounds. Like,
Mm.
think about how much tougher that finish is, or even catching it in the first place is if Giannis is the one standing next to Jimmy
Mm.
instead of Drew and Pat Connaughton. I mean, I think those are key things that you expect a championship team's head coach to be on top of.
Yeah. Eh, and it's like seeing Jimmy again in the series, we know playoff Jimmy is a real thing. This
Oh yeah,
confirms that this is in fact a real thing. This is not just a fluke of 1 or 2 years. It's he's going
one
on to
thousand
this,
percent.
and I just have to give him his flowers after seeing the 56-point game and the 42-point game and just his mentality. And do you think, like, trying to frame this, it's like he deserves the respect of being a top 10 player, or do you think he's not doing enough in the regular season to be considered a top 10 player?
I think he's a top 10 playoff performer.
Mhm.
I think you might even be able to make the argument that he's a top 5 playoff performer.
Mhm.
But I don't think there's enough that happens in the regular season And I don't think he'd care about that, frankly.
Mhm.
I think he'd take it as a compliment if you said that. So I think we know what his ceiling is, and so I think that's where people get the greatest respect, right?
Mhm.
And then like as sad as the last few years have been for Kawhi, when people talk about him and what he's capable of on the basketball court, everyone knows that when he's going, he can absolutely be the best player on
Exactly.
the floor, going against anyone, whether it be LeBron, Steph, KD, whoever, right?
Mhm.
And I think Jimmy is entering that conversation.
Mhm.
I think, for the people who have that tier of, Steph and KD and whoever, I mean, LeBron's moved down a little bit now.
Mhm.
But I think Jimmy is definitely entering that stratosphere, if he hasn't already,
Mhm.
at
Just
least in the playoffs.
he's a very interesting character. I was just seeing a clip too when I was scrolling Twitter. I think the Miami was up like 6 or 7, and you had Jimmy in Drew's face saying "I own you," and they went on to they went on to beat the Bucks. I really respect his mentality. I love how much he just wants to win. And like just seeing him go from the Timberwolves to the 76ers and then now them calling or trying to paint him as a locker room cancer. I don't believe that was the case. Just
Yep.
seeing how he is now. And like at the time, like just with what we know now, do you think that was a fair assumption of what the Timberwolves are trying to do to him? Or like how
Yeah,
do you
100%.
yeah.
I think Jimmy Butler is a winner,
Hmm.
and he is very hard nosed about it. And so when he sees things that don't align with that, he is not afraid to call it out, and he's very direct about it.
Hmm.
And um, for a team like Minnesota that doesn't know much about winning at the highest level, they couldn't deal with it.
Hmm.
And then, frankly, you look at Philly, if they don't win a chip in the next couple of years, I mean, it already looks like a mistake, but if they don't win the chip in the next couple of years, and like some of the guys that they've signed, like say for example, if James Harden ends up going back to Houston and whatnot, not re-signing Jimmy Butler is going to look like one of the biggest mistakes in like NBA history.
Hmm.
Like that's a guy that wanted to be there, and you were just like, you know what? We don't like the way you're talking to Brett Brown. We don't like the way that you're talking to the front office.
Hmm.
And so just get out of here. And, to not put their ego aside and recognize what they could have had with Jimmy and Embiid,
Hmm.
uh, is insane. And yeah, it could be the reason that, this whole process that they've been on doesn't bring them a title.
I, th- I honestly think like that was probably one of their biggest mistakes they've done, just because I was listening to the podcast with JJ Redick and Jimmy Butler, and all he wanted to do was just win. He was just calling them out in when they were reviewing like the film. No one was talking. Jimmy said no one was talking in the film room when they were watching it back. No
Yep.
one was saying anything, no adjustments. And then they insulted him when they said, "Oh, if we want to resign him," they said to his agent, "Can you control him?" And he was like, what do you mean control me? And they chose
Yep.
to sign Tobias Harris for 114 million. So I don't get what the thought process is there when you have
Yeah.
someone so dedicated to his craft and just wants to win, and that would be the Philly culture. But instead, he
Hmm.
chose Ben Simmons, Tobias Harris, and Embiid, and they
Yeah.
didn't even run it back the next year or get even close. So,
And it goes back to Chicago too,
mhm,
right? And the way that kind of ended. And, ultimately, I will say, I think things have worked out for the best because I think Miami and Jimmy are synonymous with each other. I think that is a perfect marriage in terms of their culture, in terms of how they approach things and how they want to go about things. I mean, Spolstra just said it, right?
mhm,
Jimmy is us and we are Jimmy. And I think that perfectly encapsulates it.
mhm,
I don't know, like I'm a huge Jimmy fan.
mhm.
Like he's one of my favorite players in the league. I don't know if you watch um his channel on YouTube, but his
Yeah,
videos on there are absolutely hilarious. And so yeah, I absolutely love this guy.
I just like again, I just love like the way Jimmy carries himself, and it's good to see a player with that just dedication to winning. And like I know we mentioned before the Bucks about to thinking of well, they might fire Budenholzer after this tragic event, tragic like ending last night. But the Raptors got rid of Nick Nurse, and I know when you came to when you came to our class a few weeks ago, you said they might not, and then when this happened, I was like, I wonder what he's thinking. So like, what are your reactions to that, and what are the Raptors? What do you think their next step should be after getting rid of Nick Nurse?
Well, with regards to Nick Nurse, I think it was always going to come down to also like how much he wanted to be a part of the team. And I think
Mhm,
some of the things that played out over the course of the season, he kind of had one foot out the door.
mhm,
And, by the time it came down to those final meetings before they made the decision, um, it seemed like he was fairly comfortable with being let go as well, right? This wasn't a guy who was really fighting for the job and really wanted to continue and
mhm,
build something here. So I think uh, that's one thing that stood out. And so now, in terms of moving on, obviously Ime Udoka is off the board.
mhm,
Um, and when I look at the other options, I would probably wait until the entire first round is over and seeing, if any of those head coaches get let go. Like you had Ty Lue, for example, already like just like thanking Steve Ballmer and thanking the front office. I don't know if that was
mhm.
like a goodbye message.
Yeah.
I think if he were to become available, he would absolutely be my number one choice. I think he is a fantastic coach
Mhm,
that has just been dealt a bad hand in terms of the having the availability of Kawhi and PG.
mhm,
And so, he's already won a championship. I think he's great at making adjustments in the postseason, and I think he would manage the locker room quite well. He would be at the top of my list. I like Kenny Atkinson. I really like what he was building in Brooklyn
mhm,
until KD and Kyrie came along, and I thought they had sort of rebuilt the culture there and had like this really nice hardworking mentality.
mhm,
And then obviously those two guys came in and got him out. So I like what he brings to the table. Uh, Becky Hammon is another name that I would look at. And I think she would fit well with a Raptors team that's kind of in between right now,
mhm.
and trying to figure out a direction. And I think she is not only, hard nosed enough to like bring some structure to the organization, she's also tactically very good. So I think that would be my top three.
Mhm.
I don't know what you have.
Honestly, like when Udoka came off the board, I was like, damn, who can we really sign? But now that you're mentioning it, Ty Lue would be good. I didn't get to see the him thanking everybody. I think he would be really good for the Raptors culture and the Raptors roster itself right now. I've had discussions with my friends that the Raptors are kind of just stuck in this place where they're not good enough to be a contending team, but they're not bad enough to be a lottery team.
Mhm.
So they have to make some changes immediately, and I don't know if that involves, well, if they should sign and trade Freddie because they can't just let him go for nothing. If they should trade Siakam, what do you think that the Raptors roster itself should do? Like, what type of big trades should they make? Should they look forward to? Should they tank or should they just play it out like they've been doing?
I think that they should re-sign all three of Jakob Poeltl, Fred VanVleet, and Gary Trent Jr. But uh, I think, you know 6 months from then, which is, that's kind of the restriction on when after you sign free agents. Um, I would have all three open to trade.
Mhm,
I don't think you get fair value back in a sign and trade. And so I think you get much more value if you have them on a long-term contract. And so
mhm,
I would re-sign them first, and then you deal with what comes. And that's kind of, the Raptors have kind of pushed themselves into a corner
mhm,
where I don't think they have much of a choice when it comes to this. And the last thing you want is to continue to lose free agents for nothing,
mhm,
right? That's been a trend since the championship season. And it's so counter to what they did so well before that. When you think about, you know, people would have expressed concerns over when they re-signed Terrence Ross and they ended up turning him into Serge Ibaka.
mhm,
Even DeMar DeRozan, you re-sign him, and then you turn him into Kawhi.
mhm,
You re-signed Norman Powell, you turned him into Gary Trent Jr., right? And
Mm,
so I think that's the right way to go about it. I think there's always exceptions in terms of who you move on from, where, 2015, for example, they saw that Lou Williams was clearly not a fit for what they wanted to do. And the money that he was going to need to be re-signed at was not going to be worth it. And they were like, you know what, we'll just cut our losses.
mm,
So stuff like that, I think there's exceptions. But in general, I think in terms of the Raptors getting back to managing their roster well and the way we've known them to, I would lean towards re-signing these players
mm,
and then using them as pieces to like churn over the roster later.
mm. Yeah, and that's what I think like one of the only things they can really do, right? And one of the another kind of like debates I've been having with my friend group is Pascal Siakam. I wrote an article earlier this year when he was playing really well at the start of the season that he could be considered a top 10 player just based on how he was playing. But as the season went on and we saw how Siakam was playing, I said there's nothing wrong with Siakam with the Raptors getting a number one option and Siakam being a number two option because I feel like he would thrive more in that secondary role. Do you believe that for the Raptors to win a championship, Siakam cannot be the best player on the team?
I agree with that. I think at this point we've seen uh, enough of a sample size of Siakam as the number one option to evaluate him. And I think he is at best like a 1B. And that type of player is extremely valuable, but he's not going to get you over that championship hump. And so I think the way he's elevated his playmaking, the way he's elevated his mid-range scoring, I think that should make him a very appealing option to team up with if like that tier 1A superstar is looking to come to Toronto and pair with Siakam. I mean, you even look at Kevin Durant before he went to Phoenix. Brooklyn was trying to keep him and asked him, who would you like to come over? Who can we try and get to appease you? And he said Pascal Siakam. So I think that speaks volumes of type of player Pascal is viewed as by the very best in the game. And again, it's one of those things where like you've maintained this player long enough and you've grown him long enough where the potential return you might get for him, even in a trade, even if you weren't to pair him up with someone here in Toronto, if you were to move on, you would get significant pieces, whether it's to go into a full rebuild, whether it's to get young and up and coming players that fit more of a timeline with Scotty. I think that's the beauty of having a player that's elevated his status to that point, right? Like DeMar DeRozan elevated his status to a point where they went ahead and did the trade for Kawhi, but they were also, engaging him in trade talks for Paul George. They were also engaging him in trade talks to get the draft pick that turned out to be Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And so that's the beauty of like, that internal development and, getting far more back than maybe what it cost you, which was, in the case of Siakam, the 20-odd pick.
And it's like, it's something I've been saying repeatedly because I feel like Siakam thrived under the role of Kawhi Leonard, and when he didn't have as much pressure on him to succeed with the Raptors when he was with Kawhi, because Kawhi kind of carried the offensive load, and then he was the Robin to Kawhi's Batman. With Scotty, I know we talked about this too. Scotty has the ceiling is high for him, but what I've been proposing to my friends, and this is strictly hypothetical, is if you were to approach the Timberwolves and say, or the Timberwolves were to approach the Raptors and say Anthony Edwards for Scotty Barnes, would you do that trade?
Sorry, say that again?
Just strictly hypotheticals. If the Timberwolves were to approach the Raptors and say Anthony Edwards for Scotty Barnes 1-for-1, would you do that trade?
Yes, I would do that. I think the world of Anthony Edwards. I think he's a special player. I think when you look at the surrounding talent on the roster, like he becomes that instant go-to option. But those pieces like Pascal and Fred and OG would, complement him so well. So yeah, absolutely. That is something I would consider. And yeah, because he's still under that rookie deal,
Yeah.
I guess it would be. But yeah, I don't think Minnesota's letting go of Anthony Edwards anytime soon.
Yeah, I think they've and speaking of Minnesota, they completely halted like free agency with the Rudy Gobert trade, and then I don't know what kind of just possessed the front office to wake up in the morning and make that trade. And that whole thing halted the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving free agencies. And as soon as that happened, Cat was tweeting out championship or bust. What do you like? What do you think the Timberwolves should do now? Like, do you think they need to get rid of Gobert? Because I feel like this cannot work. This combination of Cat and Gobert, it just literally just cannot win them a championship. So, do you think they need to trade somebody, or they could run it back, or what do you think they should do?
Yeah, I don't think Gobert is going to work. I think he really eats into the spacing of how they want to operate. Like even early in the season, Anthony Edwards talked about how he was trying to figure out, he's basically like, man, that lane used to be wide open for me before. Because it was a long time that he went before he had his first dunk of the season. And that was like a crazy stat. It was like so many games that he went without a dunk, which you would not think of for Anthony Edwards. And he was like, yeah, that lane is just clogged like it never used to be. And so I think they will have to try and find a way to move on from Rudy Gobert. I don't know how you do that. And yeah, they really just shot themselves in the foot with that trade when you think about the fact that, they could have kept all their assets and just had Walker Kessler, like, who frankly, as far as fit on the team and maybe even like a playoff fit would be better than Rudy Gobert. At least his ceiling is looking that way. And yeah, that trade has really set them back. And one of the reasons I would look to move on from Rudy Gobert first before Cat, I'm not a huge believer in Cat, is just because of the ages, right? And like Cat obviously fits Anthony Edwards' timeline a lot better. And so if you can move on from Rudy, try to find another piece that fits, if there's someone disgruntled somewhere else, and you kind of do a straight swap or something like that, and try to see what else can fit, then you go ahead and do that. And then it kind of puts the onus on Cat, right? And it's like, okay, we've changed things multiple times. At a certain point, you got to look in the mirror, or we look in the mirror for you and move on.
And it's just interesting you say disgruntled superstars, because that just reminds me too as well. And touching back on the Raptors, it's Damian Lillard was also, I saw, it's probably a rumor right now, but I saw the Brooklyn Nets wanted to do kind of a trade for Damian Lillard. But this reminds me of the Raptors. Do you think there's something they can put together for Damian Lillard? And do you think, obviously it would help the team, but do you think it would be enough to get them back into a contending spot?
Well, so the problem with a Damian Lillard type deal is you're trying to figure out the contracts that work, right? This is the same problem when people brought up Scotty Barnes in the Kevin Durant conversation, right? Like the contract is so expensive that with Scotty's rookie deal, now you would have to attach OG Anunoby and maybe Fred, and then it's like, okay, well, once you do that, what are you left with, right? So I think that becomes the problem. That's why something along the lines of what you suggested makes more sense, where the contracts are just aligned. I think if you could find, that hidden gem, that next guy who is young and up and coming, that doesn't have as much opportunity, but you have scouted enough to believe that he can be something. That's why when I say Pascal is a 1B, like, I would be curious to see what he'd be like with another 1B who is a shot taker down the stretch. So just extremely hypothetically, what would he look like next to like a Mikal Bridges,
Mm-hmm.
where you can trust Mikal Bridges to take the last shot, and you'd be okay with that. Um, but Bridges also isn't in that category, right, of the
Mm-hmm.
next tier. But I think you'd be very, very good. And
Mm-hmm.
his ability to shoot the three ball, his ability to pull up in the mid range, and then obviously defensively, if you had Bridges and OG on the same team, that would just be insane,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, Bridges is not someone who has a crazy contract yet.
Yeah.
So that type of player where the potential is there, is who I'd look at. And it would be along the lines like if you were to seriously look at trading Scotty,
Mm-hmm.
um, you would have to do something along the lines of what the Kings did in trading Tyrese Halliburton for Domantas Sabonis.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm just talking about like the type of player you're getting back. I don't mean in terms of a center. I mean in terms of caliber of player.
Yeah. I think also the Raptors they struggle with like shooting woes. They've had the beginning of the season they were shooting horribly from three, and I think like three out of the five starters have very tough like it's a tough run with shooting from the three. I think
Mhm.
his contract is too crazy, but I was gonna mention like, do you think also Bradley Beal would fit into that 1B category as well?
Um, I I don't I wouldn't be in favor of Bradley Beal again just because of his age.
Mm-hmm.
Like he'll be 30 this summer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would need like if you're chasing someone 30 plus, you might as well go get someone who is like that definitive like superstar type.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're gonna have to give up significant assets for Beal anyway.
Yeah.
So you might as well try to get that next tier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if it happens to be someone who's disgruntled, then go ahead. So basically, I'd rather pool all those assets together to get a Damian Lillard than I would a Bradley Beal.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That would make more sense. I would rather Dame on the team just because we've seen how he can perform in playoff situations and during the regular season. He's a high producer, amazing shooter. And
Hmm.
just switching topics to something I want to ask you, one of the last questions I would like to ask you, this All-Star game, I don't think I saw a lot of hate for this All-Star game just because of the lack of defense and
Yep.
the way it was being played. I think it was so crazy on Twitter. This is probably the most hate I've seen. What do you think they could change in the All-Star game if they can even change it? I would say something like a 1v1 tournament, maybe over the break, or maybe like another event, or in the All-Star game itself. Is there anything they could change to make it better? Because the hate I was seeing was insane. It was insane.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's just the sad reality that the players have reached a point where they just make so much money
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, okay, we've got this all-star status now. We've been named to the all-star team. That's going to be on our resume forever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one cares about what actually happens in the game, and I don't care to get hurt and potentially rule myself out of millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the sad reality. Um, and so I would probably look to see if there's another event that can be done. And um, I would honestly move all-star announcements to the end of the season
Mm-hmm.
and just not have the game.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I know that sounds like extremely radical, but I personally believe that half a season is way too short to award something as significant as All-Star.
Yeah.
And I think you do need a whole body of work. And I do think there is a difference between how you'd vote for an all-star team and how you'd vote for an all NBA team.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, I would prefer to see a whole body of work
Mm-hmm.
for someone who gets named an all-star. Uh, the thing I would love to see, and I think the risk with this is, how long would it be before things get old? Is I would love to see at this point a Team World versus Team USA.
Yeah.
Like, let's see Jokic and Shea and Giannis and all of them on the same team and go
Mm-hmm.
up against the best that the US has got.
Mhm.
And I think there would be automatic incentive to play hard in that, because I think there'd be uh
Just the
trash talking
competitive edge, yeah.
stakes. Yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be respect, all of that on the line. And so uh, I would, if I could shift away to a different type of event,
Mhm.
that is what I would love to see.
Mhm. Yeah, I actually never, I actually honestly never thought about that before. I feel like just how competitive these guys are. They'll play even harder just because there's something at stake on the line. And I've always proposed like we could either get rid of the skills challenge and then put in a one-on-one tournament and have one for the bigs, one for the guards and stuff. Because I know everyone would want to see Kyrie Irving versus Steph Curry one-on-ones. These are some of the best one-on-one players in the world. And if we could see that, it would be an amazing tournament. Give them an incentive, give them something. I also saw, this is probably nothing to do with All Star Weekend, but I saw another thing, and this is kind of again a hypothetical. You take the bottom four teams, the bottom four seeded teams, and you have a play-in tournament for them, but whoever wins that tournament gets the number one pick. I thought that would be interesting. What's like your thoughts on that? It's a really interesting idea. Don't think they'd ever do it, but I feel like a lot of people would be watching.
I mean, yeah, that would be that would be significant stakes. I don't know if that is something that would ever
Mm,
come into play, but yeah, I think finding the incentive for these players in events like these now is just getting increasingly difficult. And like even when you mention like a one-on-one game,
mm,
like you think about the dunk contest and how people have shied away from it over the years just because they don't want to embarrass themselves,
yeah,
or they don't want to be, they don't want to have this amazing theoretical status, uh, like say John Morant does or LeBron James, and Ja has said he's not going to do the dunk contest. LeBron never did the dunk contest, and so it's like if they were to shy away from that, I would
mm,
struggle to see them signing up
yeah.
to get their ankles broken by Kyrie.
That honestly, it is true. That doesn't make sense if they're off that game. If they just get, if it goes up to 11, they get like 11 owed. The memes
Right.
won't stop. So yeah, that is a fair point. But yeah, that's probably be everything I'd have to ask you today. Again, I want to thank you for coming out. I know it's so busy, especially with the playoffs going on. Everything is so hectic right now. Really appreciate it.
No, of course. I'm happy to be on. I'm happy that you asked me to be on, and look forward to seeing more of your work.
All right, thank you again.